Hello everybody, Kemo Sabi here, coming at you with another video. So this one's off of counterpunch.org. I read it by Ronnie, Cummins, published July 29th, 2019, with the topic of the 9% lie, industrial food and climate change. The climate emergency is finally getting the attention of the media and the US and world body politics, as well as a growing number of politicians, activists, and even US farmers. This great awakening has arrived just in time, given the record-breaking temperatures, violent weather, crop failures, and massive waves of forced migration that are quickly becoming the norm. Global scientists have dropped their customary caution. They now warn us that we have to drastically reduce global emissions by at least 45% over the next decade. Otherwise, we'll pass the point of no return, to find us reaching 450 parts per million or more of CO2 in the atmosphere sometime between 2030 and 2050, when our climate crisis will morph into a climate catastrophe. That's when the melting polar ice and Arctic permafrost will trigger catastrophic sea rise, fueling deadly forest fires, climate chaos, crop failures, famine, and the widespread degeneration of society as we know it. Most people now understand that we must quickly move to renewable forms of energy, such as wind and solar, and reduce our fossil fuel emissions as much as possible. But it's far less widely understood that energy conservation and renewables can't do the job alone. Alongside the massive political and economic campaign to move to 100% or nearly 100% renewable energy as soon as possible, we must put an end to the massive emissions of our corporate-dominated food and farming system and start drawing down and sequestering in our soils and forests billions of tons of legacy CO2 from the atmosphere, utilizing the enhanced photosynthesis of regenerative farming, reforestation, and land restoration. Regenerative agriculture refers to farming and grazing practices that, among other benefits, reverse climate change by rebuilding soil organic matter and restoring degraded soil biodiversity. This results in both carbon drawdown and improved water infiltration and storage in soils. Regenerative practices include reduction/elimination of tillage and use of synthetic chemicals, the use of cover crops, crop rotations, compost, and animal manures, integrating animals with perennial and annual plants to create a biologically diverse ecosystem on the farm, grazing and pasturing animals on grass, and more specifically using a planned multi-paddock rotation system, raising animals in conditions that mimic their natural habitat. If regenerative food farming and land use, which is essentially moving to the next stage of organic farming, free-range livestock grazing, and ecosystem restoration, are just as essential to our survival as moving beyond fossil fuels, why aren't more people talking about this? Why is it that moving beyond industrial agriculture, factory farms, agro-exports, and highly processed food to regenerating soils and forests and drawing down enough excess carbon from the atmosphere to restabilize our climate is getting so little attention from the media, politicians, and the general public? The International Food Information Council Foundation released a poll on May 22, 2019 that found that 22% of Americans had heard of regenerative agriculture and 55% said they had not heard of it but were interested in learning more. Why don't more people know about the incredible potential of regenerative agriculture, or more precisely regenerative food farming and land use practices to fix our climate, restoring the environment, improve the livelihoods of our farmers in rural communities, and produce more nutritious food? Why is it that the US and global climate movement until recently have focused almost exclusively on reducing emissions through renewable energy? Our collective ignorance on this crucial topic may have something to do with the fact that we never learned about these things in school or even in college, and until recently there was very little discussion of regeneration in the mass media or even the alternative media. But there's another reason regeneration as a climate solution doesn't get its due in Congress or in the media. Powerful corporations in the food farming and forestry sector, along with their indentured politicians, don't want to admit that their current degenerative climate destabilization, profit at any cost, production practices, and business priorities are threatening our very survival. And government agencies are right there, helping corporate agribusiness and big food bury the evidence that these industries in energy-intensive, climate-intensive industrial, agriculture, and food production practices contribute more to global warming than the fossil fuel industry. The U.S. Environment Protection Agency, EPA, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, repeatedly claim that industrial agriculture is responsible for a mere 9% of our nation's greenhouse gas emissions. As the EPA explains, GHG emissions from agriculture come from livestock such as cows, agricultural soil, and rice production. After hearing the 9% figure reiterated over and over again in the media, most people draw the conclusion that food and farming aren't that important as a factor in global warming, especially when compared with transportation, electricity generation, manufacturing and heating and cooling our buildings. What the EPA and USDA, big AG, chemical, and food corporations are conveniently hiding from the public is that there's no way to separate U.S. agriculture from our food system as a whole. Their faulty math, i.e. concealing food and farming emissions under the categories of transportation, manufacturing, etc., is not but a smokescreen to hide the massive fossil fuel use and emissions currently belched out by our enormously wasteful, environmentally destructive climate destabilization and globalized food system. USDA and EPA's 9% figure is ridiculous. What about the massive use of petroleum products and fossil fuels to power U.S. tractors and farm equipment, and to manufacture the billions of pounds of pesticides and chemical fertilizers that are dumped and sprayed on farmlands? What about the ethanol industry that eats up 40% of our chemical and energy-intensive GMO corn production, among other environmental crimes? An ethanol industry initiatizes farmers to drain wetlands and damage fragile lands, taking the entire process into account. Corn production for ethanol produces more emissions than it supposedly saves when burned in our cars and trucks. What about the massive release of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide from factory farms and the GMO monocrop industrial grain farm that supply these feedlots and CAFOs with animal feed? What about the methane emissions from the fracking wells that produce the natural gas that is used in proliferous amounts to manufacture the nitrogen fertilizer dumped on farmlands, fertilizer that pollutes our waterways and creates organic dead zones, as well as releasing massive amounts of nitrous oxide, 300% more damaging than even CO2, in our already oversaturated atmosphere? What about the 15 to 20% of global fossil fuel emissions that come from processing, packaging, most often non-recycled plastic, refrigerating, and transporting our highly processed, mainly junk, food and agriculture commodities on the average of 1,500 miles before they reach the consumer? What about the enormous amounts of GHG emissions, deforestation, and ecosystem destruction in the international supply chain, enabling big box stores, supermarket chains, and junk food purveyors to sell imported cheap food, in many cases food-like substances from China and overseas, to undernourished and supersized U.S. consumers? What about the enormous emissions from U.S. landfills, where wasted food, 30 to 50% of our entire production, rots and releases methane when it could be used to produce compost to replace synthetic fertilizers? A more accurate estimate of GHG emissions from U.S. and international food farming and land use is 44 to 57%, not the 9% as the EPA and the USDA suggest. We're never going to reach net zero emissions in the U.S. by 2030 as the Green New Deal calls for, without a profound change, in fact, a revolution in our food, farming, and land use practices. This essay is part of the Organic Consumers Association Regenerative Agriculture campaign. Ronnie Cummins is International Director of the Organic Consumers Association and its Mexico-based affiliate via Organica. I do hope you enjoyed the write-up, everybody. It would be awesome if you subscribed, and great if you leave me some comments. We'll see you in the next one, everybody. Don't forget to hit that bell. Cheers.